What's up guys, Professor Gustavo here. Today let's talk about American Jiu-Jitsu. Right, it seems like it's the hot topic of the moment. I've just watched a mini documentary made by Flow Grappling where they were talking about that. They were interviewing some of the biggest names pro American Jiu-Jitsu and against American Jiu-Jitsu. And what I've taken from that is that, at least for now, there is not a clear definition of what American Jiu-Jitsu is, right? I remember that the first time that I heard about American Jiu-Jitsu was probably 15 years ago or more, but back then it was more clear, right? American Jiu-Jitsu was defined, at least was described to me as a mix of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and American wrestling. That's what American Jiu-Jitsu was back then. And eventually it got absorbed by Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is so open, right? Everything that works, it gets absorbed by Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So back then there were a bunch of wrestlers training Jiu-Jitsu, and some of them, they were already getting their black belts. They had been training for a while, so they had that specific style that was very different than the traditional Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, right? In Brazil, there is very poor wrestling. Now it's a little better, but back then it was very bad. So they had great judo in Brazil, right? We have Olympic champions there, but wrestling is very weak. So it was a very different style. Eventually it got absorbed by Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and nowadays it's a little different. It's not only that, but according to the mini documentary, it's more than that. It's basically the American way of doing Jiu-Jitsu. It's the way Jiu-Jitsu is done here, the way people teach, the way the Americans do business, the way they market their own gym and the martial art, and everything related to how Americans train and do Jiu-Jitsu here, which is different than in Brazil, right? The culture is different. So not only that, there have been some techniques that have been refined and developed here. One big name is Keenan Cornelius. He keeps expanding, right, and evolving the guard game, the lapel game, which is, great. And it deserves to be called something different if it has been, developed here. He could go the route of naming his creation after his name, like we have De La Riva guard, thanks to Ricardo De La Riva. We could have Cornelius guard. We have, Williams guard, Roleta sweep, Shaolin pass. So that's all a way to recognize his efforts and everybody else's efforts, right? But we can also name a different style, American Jiu-Jitsu, as we have Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, right? Gracie Jiu-Jitsu is a specific style of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. We have Machado Jiu-Jitsu, 10th Planet Jiu-Jitsu, right? Professor Gustavo Gasperini Jiu-Jitsu. Everybody or every gym has their own style. So I think it's fair to name something else. I just think that there's a little difference, right? Between a style within Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, so a sub-style of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and a whole different martial art, right? A whole different martial art. It could happen in the future. American Jiu-Jitsu completely separates from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because they have their own thing going on, right? It could be the technique, the philosophy, the way of training, the focus and emphasis, right? It's hard to believe that if American Jiu-Jitsu turns into a whole different martial arts, that it's gonna have different techniques, right? Because techniques, grappling has been around for thousands of years. So just look at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Judo, Sambo, catch wrestling, right? They share most of the techniques. The techniques are the same, just the approach is different, right? So American Jiu-Jitsu could become a different martial art if they create something new. I don't know, right? The way that they play the game, right? It could be a martial art, it could be just a sport, right? They have their own federation, they have their own rules, their own tournaments, right? Which is no, it's gonna be different than Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Yes, that's a possibility, but I think that's a little far away, right? Like decades away, if that happens, because again, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu just keeps absorbing all new stuff, absorbing what works. So I don't think the technique is gonna be the differential here between American Jiu-Jitsu and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in the future, if it happens. But there's something else, right? I don't know. Just like the Brazilians separated themselves from Judo, right? We know that, I have a video on that, origins of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, please take a look. But when Jiu-Jitsu got in Brazil, it was actually called Jiu-Jitsu, but it was Judo, right? So what happened is that the Brazilians developed their own way of doing that art, right? Focusing more on vale tudo, focusing more on the ground game. There was not that the judo guys didn't know that or didn't do that, but they, not only the Brazilians focused a little more on that, but also the judo guys changed, right? They, due to the Kodokan rules and limitations, and they started changing his style a little bit, which made it easier for the Brazilians to create their own style different from that, because it was the Brazilians going away and the judo going away. So there was a big separation. Now with American Jiu-Jitsu, let's see what happens, right? It could be just a different style of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and that's important to say, because American Jiu-Jitsu is not a different style of Jiu-Jitsu, right? It's a different style of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because Jiu-Jitsu is Japanese, so we have to remember that. Within our community, we say Jiu-Jitsu, just Jiu-Jitsu, right? In Brazil, we just call Jiu-Jitsu. We don't call Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil, right? We just say Jiu-Jitsu. But outside of our community, Jiu-Jitsu is known as Japanese, right? So it's important to make that distinction. American Jiu-Jitsu, Templanan Jiu-Jitsu, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, they're all sub-styles of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And let's wait and see what happens, right? Maybe in the future things change, maybe American Jiu-Jitsu gets absorbed by Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, who knows, right? Let's see, whatever happens, happens. Hope you guys like this video. Click the subscribe button below, please.